The Douglasville Mayor and City Council recently adopted annual budgets for the fiscal year that started July 1. Rather unusual in a community like ours, which is experiencing growth, that these budgets actually are less than the budgets for the past year. But that's because of the economic situation we have in our community and nationwide. On today's edition of On the Agenda, I'll be talking about those budgets with City Finance Director Karin Callan. Hope you will join me. Welcome to this edition of On the Agenda. I'm City Manager Bill Osborne, and my special guest today is our City Finance Director, Karin Callan. Karin, this is your third visit, I think, on the agenda. Welcome back.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
You know, the first time that you were on the program, we talked about a couple of major revenue sources that people may not think about frequently, and that's our business licenses as well as alcohol beverage taxes and licenses. And we talked about the importance of those in our overall financial picture. You were back recently and we talked briefly about the upcoming bond referendum on the public safety municipal court building. Today, your third trip back, we're going to cover the waterfront. We're going to talk about all the city budgets for fiscal year 08-09, new fiscal year we've just entered. And so we're delighted to have you here to explain all of that for us today. Now, I know that we've just started the new fiscal year, and we have more than one budget. So tell us, identify the different budgets for us and what our actual fiscal year is.
Okay. Our chief operating fund is the general fund. We also have the Convention and Visitors Bureau, which is our 2% hotel motel tax, as well as the Conference Center Fund, which is also supported by the 2% hotel motel tax. And we also have the Sanitation Fund, which is our proprietary fund.
Okay. And our fiscal year, of course, runs July 1 to June 30th. And so at the moment, our departments have just started kind of with a fresh slate, so to speak. And you know, as we talk today, we intend to show our viewers a lot of dollar figures on the screen. And while you and I will mention some dollar amounts in our conversation, we don't want to so overwhelm everybody with dollars and cents that it's hard to follow what we're talking about. So in other words, we don't want them to be able to, we want them to see the forest rather than focusing in on the trees. But we do want people to have a clearer picture of the city's budget and the city's financial picture when we get through. And of course, even though our fiscal year just started, the budget was adopted by the Mayor and City Council on June the 16th. We started working on this a lot earlier than that. If you would, because you start the process very early in the calendar year, so tell us what actually goes on before we ever sit down and talk with the elected officials.
Okay. Around February is when we actually start the budget process. And Bill and I get together, get our calendars together, and we set up meetings with the department heads. We have our first round of meetings to get to know the information and so forth. We copy over our prior year budget as well as add some additional information for the department heads. Some of that information is current year actuals, prior year actuals, and also the current year budget, and that gives the department heads tools to analyze if the reasonableness of their new request.
Okay, so we're able to look, see where we've been to help chart a path to, where we want to go. And I know as we've always taken a very conservative approach with the budget preparation. We'd rather be at the end of the fiscal year having money in excess of what we have spent, so we've got some more money that could go into the reserve fund rather than in In the spring, you and I are trying to figure out now how we going to have enough money to pay everything that needs to be paid. So we do take a conservative approach, and of course we have to have a balanced budget under state law. So you know, from the standpoint of that conservative approach is what the mayor and city council have told us they want, and it's what they expect from us, namely running a tight financial ship. I know looking back on this budget that's recently been adopted, as we started that process, of course, we were dealing with the reality of the economic downturn that we had on the national, state, and local levels. I remember one day we even reduced the amount of hotel motel tax revenues that we expect to receive because we were thinking, well, with higher gasoline prices, people probably will be traveling less. I know as we looked at a couple of big ticket items, looking at reduction in sales taxes and with the slowdown in the building industry, that we reduced our anticipated revenues for the current fiscal year by more than 1.1 million under what they had been for the prior year. Not just residential construction slowdown, but also commercial. And of course, as you well know, on the flip side, so to speak, we were concerned about the added expenditures for gas and diesel fuel. But you know, as you and I begin these meetings with the department directors in March, we knew Mayor Thompson. At that time, the finance chairman was Henry Mitchell, who later resigned to run for Douglas County Tax Commissioner. The new finance chairman now being Roy Mims, who was the vice chair of the finance. We knew all of them were expecting us to hold the line and to take the conservative approach. So that's what we did. So what were the instructions you gave the department directors to make sure that that was followed?
Some things that we told the department directors were that there would be minimal new staff, to cut your overtime by 20%, clothing allowance by 20%, and education and training we cut by 35%. And we also adopted a new policy on the approval process, which all travel now would have to go through, would be centralized and have to go through the city manager's office for approval.
Okay. And you know, with some of the regulations that we put in, that first round of requests that we received from the department directors was, I recall, like $1.4 million more than our anticipated revenues. So obviously we had to go to the chopping block, so to speak, with the department directors, meeting with them 2 or 3 times before we finally got something ready to go to the mayor and the mayor pro tem to look at. Now, I know that as we were working on this, you had presented to me information on what you thought would be some drops in revenues. And I've mentioned the sales tax and the building permits, but kind of take us through what you were looking at on both with those and some other major revenue sources that we were expecting to drop.
Okay. For the current or the 08-09 budget, we budgeted a 5% decrease in sales tax collections, which equated to $923,000 lower than was budgeted for the prior year. Hotel motel taxes we budgeted down by $75,312. Building permits we budgeted a decrease by $192,000, and our insurance premium we budgeted a decrease by $52,570. Overall, total revenues are budgeted at 3% less than the prior year.
Right. Now, of course, as we were working on this, what the mayor and city council had told us, let's try to make those cuts so that we don't reduce our ability to provide the same level of service to the public. And we believe that we have done that. And of course, our view as the year goes along will be the best barometer of whether we accomplish that. But because we did want to be sure that we maintained a strong level of city service. As we looked at the general fund budget, you mentioned it was 3% less than last year. I think you've got some numbers you can give us on what the actual budget was, the general fund last year, and what we have this year.
Yes, the general fund budget that was adopted the prior year was $19,230,389, and the general fund budget that we adopted this year was $18,661,813.
Okay, so that's not my head calculating it, but I see on my notes that was about a little less than $570,000 reduction in that general fund budget. You know, while we're working on this budget and going through the steps to try to be very cognizant of needs and be very deliberate in making our decisions, we were hearing from the state capitol with some of the legislative leaders that spending at the local government level is out of control. Local governments were being accused of that we decide on all the things we wanted to spend money on, and then we would say, okay, how much we got to raise taxes to do that? You know, I don't know what local governments, if any, they really could point to. I know that's not the way we work here. That we look at what our revenues are going to be, conservatively estimated, and then that's the basis on which we determine the money that we can budget for expenditure purposes. That we must have a balanced budget, of course, and that's what we make sure that we do. And we reduce down the revenue, we reduce down the expenditure request to tie in to the revenues. Now, from the standpoint of the general fund that you were talking about a minute ago, give us a little rundown on what's included in the general fund, what departments, and how does it kind of break out?
Okay. The largest expense of the general fund right now is public safety at 45% of the total general fund budget. And that includes patrol, detectives, administration, motors, records, special operations, and the school resource officers. The second largest is general administration, and that accounts for 31% of the total general fund budget. And that includes finance, information services, engineering, code enforcement, planning, zoning, communications, garage, city manager, city clerk, city attorney, and the legal.
Okay. And then we've got a little more in the general fund budget. What are the smaller pieces?
Some smaller pieces are Parks and Recreation. That accounts for 8% of our total general fund budget. Community Development at 5%. Public Works at 8%. Judicial System at 2%. And Debt Service at 1%.
Okay. Appreciate that information. And I tell you, at this time, we're going to take a quick break, and then we'll be back to continue to talk about the city budget. Welcome back to On the Agenda. I'm talking today with Karin Callan, the Finance Director of the City of Douglasville, and we're talking about the city's new annual budgets that we've just entered our new fiscal year effective July 1. I want to return to a subject that we were talking about earlier in the program, and that was on revenues. And of course, you were talking about how we were projecting some decreases in some of our major revenue streams, sales tax, building permits. I want to talk a little bit more about that. Of course, we had said that we had more than 1.1 million that we were expecting the drop in revenues from on sales tax and the permits. But, you know, sales tax is still the top of our revenue sources. Give us a little rundown on that, and you don't have to round the numbers off a little bit. We're going to show them on the screen for you.
Sales tax, like Mr. Osborne said, is our largest revenue source at 25% of our total general fund revenues, and that is budgeted for the current year at $4.6 million. Property taxes is our second largest revenue source, budgeted at $4.4 million, and that accounts for 24% of our total general fund revenue. Licenses and permits account for 12% of our total general fund revenue at $1.6 million. Fines and forfeitures total $1.3 million at 8% of the total general fund budget. Insurance premium tax, a little over $1 million, representing 6% of our total general fund revenues. And franchise taxes represent 10%, and they include $785,000 from Georgia Power and $568,000 from Greystone Power.
Okay. You know, when you hear that long list that you have gone over, it makes us realize that we're very fortunate to have so many different sources of revenue, that some towns are trying to rely almost totally on the property tax, or sometimes towns may be, smaller towns may be looking at almost a total reliance on alcohol beverage tax. But we certainly are blessed to have a lot of different revenue sources. You know, early in the program, when we identified the general fund, and that of course is what we've been talking about really thus far in this program, but we said that we had some other funds: sanitation fund, the Convention and Visitors Bureau fund, our conference center fund, and of course we keep these separate. And basically these are self-sustaining funds, though certainly if one of them had a problem, we could put some general fund dollars into that fund, but our budget process and the way we operate is to try to make sure that those are self-sustaining. But we've actually made some reductions in those funds also for this fiscal year. Tell us about those. Okay.
I'll start with the sanitation fund. And our prior year budget showed projected revenues of a little over $4 million. The budget that was just adopted shows revenue of $3.8 million, which is a decrease of about $244,150. In addition to garbage and trash collections, the sanitation department includes recycling, street sweeping, and activities of Keep Douglasville Beautiful.
Okay.
Also, we have the conference center. Adopted in June 2007, we're showing $607,333 in revenues, while the new fiscal year budget shows $576,000, and this is a decrease of $31,133 for the conference center. And the Convention and Visitors Bureau budget, last year we budgeted $480,333. And the current year, we budgeted $459,200, which is a decrease of $21,133. So we do have decreases across all the funds.
Right, and you know, and I think that just shows that we've tried to look at everything from a uniform basis, and everybody's had to take their cuts in a sense. But even though we have decreased the budget, our population continues to grow. Now, the rate of growth has gone down, but we're still seeing an increase in Douglasville's growth, commercial and residential, though residential certainly has slowed. But, you know, as we look at all of this, we have to keep in mind in our police department what the mayor and council had decided 3 or 4 years ago, that we wanted to be sure that we maintained a particular ratio of police officer to population. And so we've said every time we have 1,000 additional people to move into Douglasville, we want to add the equivalent of 2.8 police officers. And in recent years, that has equated to adding 1 new police officer with the start of each quarter.
Right.
And that's what we budgeted, of course, for this year. And time will tell if we need to add an officer each quarter. But we are certainly dedicated to maintaining that ratio because we want to provide good public safety services in the city. I think other than those new police officers, the only new job slots that we created in this budget was we had 1 additional clerk position in municipal court, 1 more employee for city TV, and 1 more animal control position. And of course, as he's done in recent years, Police Chief Wisnett has been able to pick up some additional operating costs for the police department that we were not able to fund through the general fund, and it told him we couldn't fund that, but he was able to use drug funds to do that. And as you mentioned earlier, we did some cuts with our employees, both in terms of the training budget and also we've delayed any consideration even of merit increases or cost of living increases until later in the year, until we have a better handle on how the economy may go. you know, as you look at the budgeting process, even though we are cutting back, we still are trying to be sure that we're putting some aside for a rainy day. We've got a couple of rainy day funds. Tell us about those.
We have the Untouchable Fund, and that name was made by Rochelle Robinson, she's a former council member, and that is a policy that we set in which we keep $2.5 million at least in our fund balance. Anytime we budget or to go below that, it has to be approved by City Council. Then we also have the $5.5 million in which we have for difficult times or special projects.
Okay. Well, it's good to have both of those funds available, and as you say, that $2.5 million is the Untouchable Fund, and we do try to make sure that we have a good reserve fund. You know, we've touched just very briefly on capital projects, and I want to come back to that as we conclude because we actually have two kinds of capital projects. We have those that we label as capital projects, things that have a life expectancy, so to speak, of more than 3 years of service. So we would have vehicles and road equipment. We'd also look at some small construction projects. And these we would look at possibly being able to fund from some of that $5.5 million reserve. The other, of course, are the bigger projects that would either be through SPLOSH if the voters at some point approve another SPLOSH, because you're talking about major road projects, major building projects. We also are looking at, in September, having September 16th, the general obligation bond issue referendum for voters to decide if they want to provide for a new public safety municipal court building, and those, of course, are very special. But you know, as we look at this fall, our cash balance at the end of last year, after we had completed the purchase of 2 parcels of property, one to be the site of this new public safety building, the other for a future park south of I-20. Our reserves were a little less than $6 million. And I know that as you're working with the auditors on the audit for the fiscal year 2007-2008 year, that when we get that final cash balance figure, that we can look at that amount of money as compared with the or the $6 million that we had at the end of the previous year. And that would be an amount that we would look at for some capital projects with some needed automobile purchases, some small construction projects, and still be able to maintain that cash reserve of $6 million. And that's something we'll be talking, of course, with the mayor and council on later in the year. Well, Karin, I appreciate you being back with me today. Any closing words for our viewers?
No, I'd just like to say that the city is very fortunate that we did not have to use any of our cash reserves to fund the current budget, and I do feel that our revenue projections are very conservative, and I'm very thankful that we have a council that does support us in being conservative with our projections.
Okay. It's been great to have you today. We'll have you back another time because I'm sure that we'll have some other financial issues to talk about. But to you and our viewers, have a great day. As the fiscal year unfolds, Finance Director Karin Callan and I will be keeping a close watch on how our revenue sources are coming through. And if we need to look at making some reductions in the expenditure levels in order to keep us in good financial condition, we'll be making those recommendations to the mayor and the city council, who've instructed us to be very prudent with the city's dollars. We'll be making reports to them throughout the year, but we'll be back to make another report to you early in 2009 on the agenda. This is Bill Osmond signing off today.